This is the Dangerous Waters podcast, where we dive deep into dangerous waters. I'm your host, Alex, and in today's episode, we will be discussing what is happening around the world as well as at home. First, let's look at the new Ukraine war casualty figures and the discussion and debate around that. At home, we'll take a look at updates on the United Healthcare CEO's murder, as well as Trump's statements on a potential Biden prosecution and immigration policies. Coming right up. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I know my first two episodes were very heavy on Syria. Obviously, a lot of stuff is going on in Syria, and I decided to put a little bit more of my time into covering all the things that are happening there. But now we can finally address the other things that are happening around the world and at home. Ever since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, one of the major points of contention that we've been seeing is how many deaths, how many casualties did both sides suffer during the war? This is a question that we probably will never know until maybe decades after the end of the conflict. But it is something that is heavily debated and something that is very important because it has monumental impact on the types of decisions that leaders are making, that Trump potentially could be making, Zelensky, Putin, all of that. The cost of the war, the human cost. A lot of times when we talk about wars, we discuss, let's look at how many tanks each side has. What's their artillery looking like? Do they have the fighter jets, the air denial capabilities? Can they strike strategically in targets of importance and really create problems for the other side? But one of the things that we don't look at as much nowadays, especially with the rise of drone warfare, is that human cost. We're not looking as much on how many lives are being taken every day because of war. And this conflict in Ukraine is by far the largest human death contributor war-wise that we've seen recently. There's just been so much death, so much suffering going on both sides of the conflict. Everybody knows this, but we don't know the actual casualty figures. We only have estimations. We only have leaked documents. We only have potential reports from maybe reliable sources, but it's not the same. We don't actually have exact figures, and even the ballpark estimates are wildly varying in scope. Now, why are we talking about this again? Because recently, Trump's statement regarding the Syria conflict has fanned the flames and reignited the discussion on casualty figures in Ukraine. Now, let's take a look. So, what Trump is saying, based on his recent Truth Social post, is that Ukraine has suffered 400,000 casualties, while Russia has suffered 600,000 casualties. Now, casualties sounds bad, right? It sounds like, oh, these people are gone. They're never going back to the war effort. They're dead. But if you look at what casualties actually means, it means both dead and wounded. Now, depending on the capabilities of the armies and the infantry that are fighting, casualties can be very high as a ratio. Wounded can be very high compared to deaths. So let's say the United States, for instance, roughly when the U.S. fights wars, the wounded to death ratio is approximately 10 to 1. So for every 10 soldiers that are wounded in battle, roughly 1 will perish. In other wars, in general, the casualty number or ratio is 3 wounded per 1 death. Now, both sides, Ukraine and Russia, they don't have the type of support networks that the United States has when fighting wars. And if we're being honest, they don't care about the human cost as much as the United States does about our troops. So 400,000 casualties in total means we're seeing roughly 100,000 deaths on the Ukraine side, whereas Russia is seeing about 150,000 deaths, the rest being wounded. Now, the problem with using the 3-to-1 wounded to death ratio is that it's very difficult to say if that's actually the case, because maybe Russia or maybe Ukraine don't have, maybe they don't have that kind of support network for their troops. Maybe they're not able to medevac as quickly, and maybe the circumstances are totally different. We don't know for sure, which is why we cannot use these numbers. And propaganda from both sides often seek to try to change people's perceptions on the casualty ratios going on in the war, so they can claim, oh, well, maybe Russia has more casualties but way fewer deaths, or actually one side has way more deaths because they are unable to care for their troops, and therefore that number, if let's say it's 200,000 casualties, maybe half of them are deaths. Now, like I said, we don't know for sure, and Trump's figures are difficult to ascertain. You know, where did he get these figures from? Who knows? But what we do know is that after he made this Truth Social post, Zelensky came out and made new statements on the war from his side. Now, when you look at a war and you look at one country's Ministry of Defense being involved in that effort, do you want to trust the figures coming out of the Ministry of Defense of that war? Probably not, because they have the agency and the motive to lie about the numbers of deaths. Ultimately, war, beyond just the fighting itself, is an information war. There is so much narrative building going on in these wars. Can we convince people to join our side? Is it a worthwhile fight? And these are questions that both Russia and Ukraine are seriously pondering. So we can't really fully say for sure, but anyways, back to the point. Zelensky claims that around 43,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died since the Russia-Ukraine war began. This is according to a New York Times article that just came out today. He also said that roughly 370,000 cases were made of providing assistance to the wounded. Now, what this means is that these numbers are, in fact, very close to Trump's numbers of casualties, because providing assistance to the wounded, documenting those issues, 370,000 is pretty much the casualty count, because in a lot of ways, when troops are wounded, it doesn't have to be bad. It could be a light scratch, maybe a fragment of an artillery shell impacted your rib or impacted your arm, and it doesn't really matter too much. They can take it out and they'll rejoin the war in a month, let's say, just as an example. So Zelensky is saying 370,000 people have been injured in total, essentially, with roughly 50% of those injured being able to return to the fight. Now, this number is also very huge, because casualties does not mean permanently put out of action. Out of the people who have been wounded, historically speaking, roughly 50% of those people end up going back into battle because the wounds sustained aren't that bad, and they're able to continue fighting. So what this means is Zelensky's major point of contention with Trump, well, not really with Trump, but with the overall information landscape, is that he claims only 43,000 people on the Ukrainian side have actually died. Whereas if you look at the 3-to-1 ratio, it would be over 100,000. So Zelensky is essentially saying that the Ukrainian army is capable of supporting logistics and medical transports to the extent that they're able to save the majority of the wounded soldiers. Now, whether you believe that or not, that's up to you to decide. I don't know either. Like I said, anyone who does claim to know definitively what's going on, they don't, right? We can only look at local conflicts, local battles. We don't have a full picture. Maybe only the Pentagon has that full picture. We don't. I definitely do not. So I'm not going to claim to know what's going on, but that is essentially the implication of Zelensky's claim. Now, this goes against Wall Street Journal's recent figure count as well. In an article on Wall Street Journal, they claimed that there were roughly 80,000 deaths on the Ukrainian side. And Zelensky obviously refuted this, saying that the deaths were far less, 43,000. That's almost half of the claimed Wall Street Journal death count. And interestingly enough, if you look at the leaked Pentagon documents from Jack, I forget his last name, Teixeira, he, during the Pentagon leaks on Discord, the U.S. claimed that there were roughly 17,000 Ukrainian deaths versus around 65,000 Russian deaths. This is based on top secret information, but we also know now that the Pentagon has been, at least from the information gathering scene, heavily reliant on open source intelligence figures. It's hard to say where this information came from for these briefing slides, so it's not fully trustworthy, but if that's the case, the 43,000 figure does kind of make sense, at least if you continue the narrative going forward over this X amount of time after the documents were leaked to the press. So 43,000, at least if you look at that document, is very well within the realm of possibility. Now, Zelensky also made the claim that Russia suffered 198,000 dead and 550,000 wounded. So he's also, in terms of the wounded number and the death number, we are looking at around, 750,000 deaths, which matches up with the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the numbers that are coming out from them. Now, it's hard to say, obviously, if these are true or not. Most likely, they are over-exaggerated, and most likely they exaggerate their own deaths. They underestimate their own deaths. And this goes to both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. Both sides want to maintain a grip of the information space, and they want to lower the perception of the other side by saying, oh, well, so many more of their side has been killed versus our side where we're much safer. But obviously, this doesn't apply to every war. It doesn't apply to every side. If you look at, for example, the war in Gaza, Israel actually has the incentive to sort of post every single death that's going on to try to persuade the Israeli population to continue the war effort, because they're saying, look at what the other side has done to our soldiers. We're suffering deaths here. We need to continue and make sure that the job gets done. So it obviously depends on the circumstances of each conflict. It depends on the country, the narratives that the country wants to build. But the implication of this claim that Zelensky is saying on the Russian side is that despite the casualties being somewhat similar, not totally, but within the realm of reason being somewhat similar, that Russia is suffering a lot higher of a death ratio compared to the wounded. And like I said, I don't know if that's true. It probably isn't, but I would say the same about the Russian side as well. What they're coming out with, the information that they release, who knows? And if we look at the recent interview that Tucker Carlson made with Sergei Lavrov, Russia's Minister of Defense, just recently he asked Lavrov how many people died in the war. And now Lavrov decided to instantly pivot to a different topic and talk about Palestine. This is obviously a lot of people say, a very classic case of whataboutism, where instead of talking about this issue at hand, let's redirect to a different topic that's more politically convenient for my interests. And ultimately, Tucker never got a figure from the Russian Minister of Defense, and he probably won't. Russia does not have the interest in exposing this type of information, because if they do, more than likely the number of deaths and the human cost of this war on the Russia side is very powerful, very strong. Even if Zelensky is under or over reporting these numbers, there is just such a large amount of deaths that are happening. Everybody can see the combat footage that's going on, the drone warfare. It's sick. It's dangerous. And Russia does not want that kind of information out. With that being said, let's pivot to domestic affairs. In America, the biggest news story of the week, I would say, is the United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson's murder. Just to give a rundown of what happened, he was gunned down by potentially a trained assassin in the middle of Midtown Manhattan, right outside Central Park. This happened at right before 7 a.m., where there were practically nobody in the street, but this man came out of nowhere, pulled out a suppressed pistol, probably subsonic rounds, which means very little noise, if at all, shot him maybe 5 to 6 times, and fled the scene. So we have new information out about this murder. So the potential suspect has been found by law enforcement, which means that they now have a name. They now have direct ties with this person that they've linked to being the potential murderer in this case. Unfortunately, we do not have this information publicly yet. Law enforcement has not produced the name of this suspect, so we are still left in the dark about it, but they are saying that they have a name. They've also released 2 new pictures of the suspect. One of them is in a taxi cab, and it does kind of match the description. We also know, based on some of the information released earlier, that the suspect flew in, or not sure if he flew in, but he came from the Atlanta area, roughly in November. And then he escaped, probably via bus, back to the Atlanta area. So he's definitely not a New York native. We also know that the backpack that he dropped in Central Park was discovered, and law enforcement found fake Monopoly money in the bag. Now, I think this is a very interesting development because it obviously shows the intention of this murderer. He clearly knew what he was doing. He set up this evidence to sort of send a political message to the healthcare industry. Now we also look at the bullet cartridges that had writings on them, which are sort of within that same faith, within that same type of motive of sending a message to the industry and shaking things up. So this is, by definition, this man is a vigilante. He did this on purpose. Now, we still don't know if he was a hired hit or if he did this organically on his own with his own motives. But now that law enforcement has a name, they know who to look for. This is going to be probably moving forward in a very rapid fashion, and he will probably be caught very soon. Now, let's take a look at what Trump has been saying recently on Truth Social, as well as a new NBC interview. So, on a potential Biden prosecution, he raised this issue during his campaign where he said he would prosecute Biden and the crime family. But in his most recent interview with NBC, he actually stated, quote, "I'm not going to go back into the past. I'm looking to make our country successful. Retribution will be through success. If we can make our success, this country, successful, that would be my greatest. That would be such a great achievement." Essentially, Trump is not on a path of retribution, at least based on this interview. And I think it's a very interesting pivot because he campaigned on this issue. It's very hard, draining the swamp, cleaning the deep state, potentially causing legal issues to people who wronged him. And this is so much so that Joe Biden decided to have meetings about preemptive pardons for some of Trump's enemies. Now, if this statement is correct, what this means is that going forward, Trump, once again, like he did in 2016's presidential run and his presidency in 2016, he probably will not spend too much time going after major adversaries like the Clintons, the Bushes, the Bidens, that, a lot of people wanted him to do. At the same time, though, there is a possibility that he is saying this to distract his enemies. This is hard to say, but a lot of times what goes down in the information space can influence real decisions that are happening. So if Trump says this, perhaps it's giving an incentive to Biden to say, look, your allies that have gone after me, maybe we're not going to actually go after them, so you don't have to pardon them preemptively. One, that would be a bad decision on your end because it makes you look bad. But two, because there's no real risk of these people becoming the next target of Justice Department investigations of criminal cases, for example. Now, maybe this is his plan. Who knows? Like I said, I don't know Trump, but this is a very fascinating statement and a pivot from his rhetoric prior to the election. Alongside that statement, Trump also made new concessions with the Democrats. He claimed that he would work with the Democrats to protect DACA, DACA being obviously the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This was a policy that existed for a limited time within the Obama administration, in which certain children in this country who did not have parents able to sponsor them were able to stay and work in America and basically get renewed every couple years. Now, these people, they're in a very difficult situation because they're not illegal immigrants. They were in the country legally under Obama era legislation. They are working in America. They already have established a presence in this country for over a decade. So Trump decided this time he's going to work with the Democrats, at least try to work with the Democrats to help this group of people. And I think it's an olive branch. If you look at a lot of what the Democrats have been saying about Trump, they're saying he's going to do mass deportations, a lot of fear-mongering going on, saying that, maybe Trump would even deport actual law-abiding U.S. citizens. Now, this is not what Trump has said during the campaign. This is not what his border czar has been saying, but there has been that kind of perception going on about Trump. So I think his policy now of saying he wants to work with the Democrats to protect DACA recipients is an olive branch to the wider community to say, look, I'm not unreasonable on this issue. I still have some kind of standing here. I don't want the exact opposite that you do, and we can work together. Now, if this works or not is up to debate. Who knows? But ultimately, I believe this is a good thing for America, that even on the most difficult of issues, immigration, Trump is able to reach out to the other side and say, look, we can work with you. Even when he won the election, even when he has that supermajority in Congress, in the Supreme Court, in the executive branch, he's saying, look, we will still work with you because I believe that this is good for our country. Now, I know I'm framing it in a certain way, but I think this is a very fascinating development and sort of a shift from Trump's normal rhetoric on immigration, similar to Trump's shift on the Biden prosecution. So he's coming out and he's saying these things that are different from his normal rhetoric. Very fascinating stuff coming out from Trump, and potentially a teaser for what we are going to see in the next Trump administration and the next 4 years. As always, thank you for tuning in to Dangerous Waters, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye-bye.